I'm delighted to be here. So I thought most of my research really focuses on a very specific topic, which is retrofitting the suburbs. And I'm going to talk about that tonight and tomorrow night. But today, I'm actually giving a somewhat more academic lecture that I thought I would sort of ask the question, who designs the city? Because we think we sort of know, but actually I don't really think we do. And I'm both, I am an academic, so on the one hand. I also sometimes practice and actually engage in trying to design cities, but I'm also researching and analyzing. And then I wear a third hat as well. I'm the chair of the board of this organization called the Congress for the New Urbanism, which is an organization, and I'll talk about that. But in academia, in the US anyway, new urbanism is viewed very suspiciously. We're not always, so there are lots of debates about which discourses we really should be doing. So I thought I would run through some of these various debates. I don't know, the slides I know are a little washed out. Is it possible to dim the lights a little bit more so that you can see a little bit more? I don't know. So, I'll come back to this same slide at the very end of the lecture and try to get a little more discussion. But really, the question is, who designs the city? Is it the people? I mean, for 2,000 years or so, it's been ordinary people design their cities. Today, we have approximately 1/6 of the world's population living in slums, building the city for themselves. In more developed world, it's, other people are taking on those roles. Is it the elected officials? Is it the politicians who really design, are the ones who make things happen? Is it the developers? Is it the money? That's what really designs the city. Or is it public sector planners? This profession that now a newly licensed profession in Russia. Is that who really designs the city? Or is it private sector consultants, the urban designers, the architects, the landscape architects who are hired to come in to cities that may not be where they live, may or may not, but are hired to come in and design those cities? The reality is, it's sort of all of the above. I mean, I don't think cities are not designed by only one group. Cities are complex, and we want them to be complex. If we oversimplify the city, we kill it. So, but since, for those of us who are being educated to become professional people designing cities, we need to figure out ways to think about how to engage all these other disciplines and how to design the city. And that's where we start to get all these different movements. So in the US right now, I would say new urbanism has been around as a movement for a little over 20 years. And I will talk quite a lot about new urbanism and give you my perspective as someone who's been very, very involved with it for most of those 20 years. But it has some competitors. There are because it's been around for as long as it has, there's lots of other movements trying to knock it out of the way and propose more up-to-date ideas. Everyday urbanism, light urbanism, landscape urbanism, which sometimes also gets called ecological urbanism. So I'll talk a little bit also about the pros and the cons of these alternative movements. I don't know, is everyday urbanism well known at all in Russia? I'll talk about it. Okay, yeah. Light urbanism is the phrase that Rem Koolhaas used at one point in one of his essays. So I know you all know who Rem Koolhaas is. You can't it's pretty hard not to know Koolhaas and OMA. How about landscape urbanism? Does that phrase mean anything in a Russian context? All right, I'll introduce it. I'll let you know. So between these different movements, some of the key questions that come up are, who should lead in the design of cities? Should it be the planner? In some respects, what we've seen in the US was that planners gave away the physical, spatial design of cities. They sort of left the field at the end of the 60s. And then the architects kind of moved in the late 70s and began to take over the spatial design of cities. But now we've seen in the last decade, the landscape architects are saying, no, we should be in the lead because we really understand environmentalism and the issues of sustainability. Really, landscape architects should be the leading. Another one of the bigger questions, the sort of more philosophical questions that comes up in these debates are the virtues of the planned city versus the indeterminate city. Should we completely plan our cities and assume that somehow we can control all the growth, or should we allow them to grow more organically, allow freedom? How much freedom? How much planning? There's always a tug of war. There's also the methodology gets debated. Should we base our decisions of what is good in a city on empirical observation of what has worked in the past? Or do we need to be more imaginative? Do we need to speculate and gamble a little bit with the future because the times are always changing and looking back to the past won't really prepare us? There's also, I think, a debate in here about smallness versus bigness. Both have their advantages, both have their disadvantages. And whether you're talking small streets versus big streets, whether you're talking small businesses versus big corporations, all levels of smallness and bigness kind of come into play. And then there's, of course, the style issue. And New Urbanism is very associated with traditional style. Most of these other movements are more associated with modern style at the scale of the buildings primarily. And there's a question whether now, it's almost 100 years since the Bauhaus and the early modern architecture, is modernism really still associated with the classless society? Or is modernism now associated more with the cultural elites? Or is traditionalism associated more with the cultural elites? Or is traditionalism seen as the vernacular of the middle, the sort of ordinary class? These questions have no single answer, but different people take very different perspectives on them. So ultimately, again, it comes down to who is the city designed for? Are you designing a city for sort of everyday, ordinary people? Are you designing the city for the elites? Are you designing the city for the business interests? And there's always, there are differences. So, I think it's interesting relative to Moscow and the recent design competitions that Moscow has had. You had the Office of Metropolitan Architecture of Rem Koolhaas won first prize for their proposal for the Greater Moscow region. Well, that would seem to indicate that whoever was on the jury thought that light urbanism was the appropriate direction for Greater Moscow. So I'll talk more about light urbanism, but keep that in mind. Is that what he was proposing? Is that what was appropriate? At the scale of the extension of the new territory, Antoine Grumbach won that design competition with a proposal that on the one hand had some very new urbanist kind of attention to light rail and transit-oriented development, but also had sort of modernist super blocks and attention to more green space. So he was sort of combining aspects of landscape urbanism, new urbanism, a little of everything. And then the federal city competition at the smallest scale was won by firms that are very strongly identified with new urbanism. So what does it say about Moscow that we have winning design competition proposals that kind of represent several of these different points of view? So these are all questions for discussion. This slide, I could spend a lot of time or a little time, but this is a kind of oversimplified American view of the timeline of urban design discourse. When I teach a course in urban design theory at Georgia Tech, and I use this slide at the beginning of the semester to kind of say, all right, we're going to talk. I expect you by the end of this class to know about the City Beautiful movement, the Garden City movement at the turn of the century, of the 20th century. Certainly the Athens Charter that declared the goals of the modern city, the separation of uses, the functional city where we would use highways to get around to the various sort of towers in the park and separated uses. In the US then in the 50s and 60s, we saw massive suburbanization. In the US, most of the wealth left the cities and went out to the brand new suburbs in the 50s and 60s. We built a lot of highways that facilitated that expansion. And then as our cities were beginning to sort of die and empty out, there was a program of urban renewal where we bulldozed much of what was left. We put in super blocks and towers or sort of slabs, towers in the park, very much similar to the sort of microrayon model you have here in Moscow. So we did a lot of that but more in our cities, not so much out in our suburbs. 1961, do you guys all know Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities? Is that a book you guys are all familiar with? Yes. All right. Yes. We read the whole book. I make my students read Death and Life from cover to cover. We read the whole thing. Still an amazing book. So her critique, you guys are well aware of. What's also, though, kind of interesting in the US context, I don't know how much it relates in Russia, but 1972 is sort of a key moment where one of the public housing projects in St. Louis, Missouri, was dynamited. So it was an example of the modernist housing project with the towers in the park that had become so crime-ridden and was so neglected and the social conditions were so bad, the residents themselves demanded that the buildings be blown up. So for Charles Jenks, a architecture critic, sort of defines that as the beginning of postmodernism. It was the end of an era, the end of faith in modernist ideals. If modernism was supposed to produce this ideal, classless, the good society, and we were going to build public housing that would make people's lives better, and yet the people themselves demanded that the project be blown up, suddenly you had a lot of architects and planners becoming very doubtful about the virtues of technology, about the virtues of function, abstraction. Architects tended to become much more interested in issues of cultural meaning and the physical context. Architects kind of got very interested in how to relate buildings more to the existing traditions rather than just being functional and being modern. They went more traditional. Planners tended to shift away from physical planning, being afraid that the lesson of Pruitt-Igoe was that design doesn't work. that the only way to solve social problems is through policy and management. So at least in the US, planners have really moved away from design, and architects moved closer to it. 1975, New York City almost went bankrupt, and President Ford's response to the cities at that time was drop dead. You know, we don't care. Basically, there was no more argument for cities. He sort of said, you know, people don't want to live in cities anymore. The government is not going to bail out the cities. The suburbs are really the new model. So by the 70s and 80s are really, they're miserable times for cities. Crime is up. Cities are not doing very well. In 1993 is the first time, but you start to get a lot of architects really concerned about the cities and trying to revive urbanism and saying there's so many good things about urbanism. We have to bring urbanism back. And Congress for the New Urbanism first officially meets in 1993. It had been around for about 10 years, but at first as people doing things, but it officially becomes an organization in 1993. And at that point, it's really in reaction to sprawl and to the loss, the way the cities were declining, that desire to try to rebuild the cities. The New Urbanists have a charter. They wrote out 26 principles and declared that design does matter and that design can help to solve the integrated problems of rural areas, suburban areas, and urban areas. So that's when CNU really officially gets started. Just 2 years later, Rem Koolhaas starts light urbanism, although he doesn't really make it a movement. It's just kind of Rem himself writing an essay where he says planning has failed. Every attempt to try to accommodate growth, the city just keeps growing faster than we can possibly plan for it. You know, the planners have been trying to control sprawl and can keep everybody in cities, and meanwhile, the world has suburbia has happened. So Koolhaas argues that planning is a failure, and he says, we just have to lighten up. So he calls for light urbanism. A couple years later, in 1999, a bunch of Californians, John Chase, Margaret Crawford, and John Kaliski, publish a book called Everyday Urbanism. And they're the ones who really come across and saying, yeah, planning may have failed. What we need is not planning by planners. We need city making by people who live in the cities. And so I'll talk a little more about that. But jump ahead to 2006, a new book comes out called The Landscape Urbanism Reader. And it was based on a 1997 conference, but it only got published later. And that's really where this argument that landscape architects really are the ones who should be designing cities because they understand ecological processes and sort of long-term, you know, when you plant things, you're expecting the life to take, it takes a long time for plantings to mature, and they understand the sort of longer lifespan of what cities really need. More recently, we've seen Zaha Hadid's office with Patrick Schumacher get interested in parametric urbanism, and Tom Main. So we're starting to see all sorts of other now digital things. Last thing on here is that, you all probably know, 2011 is when the United Nations reports that half of the global population live in urbanized areas. As this was a watershed moment. 2011 is when we hit the halfway mark. Now, it doesn't mean everyone's living in cities. They're living in urbanized areas. And so and in fact, one could argue that most of that population are actually living on the peripheries and living in more suburban conditions than are really living in those, you know, the high-rise downtown kind of image. But so that's sort of, again, just a little bit of the historical background. I'll just an image to kind of show this. This is the context in which new urbanism arose. This notion that the government's not going to help cities, government's giving up on cities. We're just building suburbia with lots of cookie cutter houses. It tends to be an emphasis in suburbia on providing people with a private realm that really appeals to consumers, and people want to buy their private house with a little bit of lawn, but a public realm that then becomes very degraded. Public realm that is completely consumer-oriented, car-oriented, not very attractive, certainly not very loved, and not very different from some of the Moscow roads out as you get further out. As the new urbanists have continued to kind of critique sprawl and the unintended consequences of suburbanization, I think there's been even more recognition that it turns out suburbia is actually not as healthy as one used to think. Suburban living correlates with much lower, very sedentary lifestyles, and we see very high risks of obesity, suicide, death by automobile crashes. We see that suburbanites, because they're driving so much and have detached buildings that lose more energy, they have much higher carbon footprints, and they contribute more to climate change. We see that traffic congestion is actually worse in the suburbs than it is in the downtowns. The downtowns tend to have a grid network that distributes traffic. In the suburbs, the neighborhoods never want the cut-through traffic, so you have very underused local streets that funnel all the traffic onto the big arterial roads that then get overcrowded. The stereotype is to think of the suburbs as relatively affluent, that the poor are always in the inner city. That's not true anymore. Since 2005, more Americans who are living in poverty live in suburbs than in cities or in rural areas. So, and part of that is because the suburbs are simply not as affordable as we used to think they were. Most Americans still tend to think that the most affordable housing will be the furthest out you go to get to the cheap land, and we call this drive till you qualify for a mortgage. So that the most affordable housing will be the furthest out. But that comes also with the highest transportation costs. And today, with gas prices, we're seeing that if you're in the lower half of all incomes, you are in the US, you are more likely to be spending more of your income on transportation than you are on housing, because we don't have as much transit once you get outside of the central city. We often don't even have bus service out in a lot of the suburbs, so you have to have a car, and it really increases prices. So all of these reasons, the critique of sprawl really kind of gets started in the late 80s. And you start to see diagrams like this one that shows a little railroad town off of the railroad is kind of over in the distance there on the left, and then a typical highway interchange. But the minute that highway interchange is built, then the land gets zoned for commercial. And the typical zoning of, this is not an accident. This is what is planned. And what is still on the books in most of the US is that all the land around the intersection, you'll get a shopping mall on one quadrant, then you'll get a little hotel, a gas station, some fast food, maybe a small office building, small apartments buildings, each with its own parking lot, completely unwalkable, consuming a lot of land, typical sprawl pattern. And again, it's exactly what our regulations require, because they require that each building have its own parking, its own access. But people began to ask, what if, on the right, what if that same amount of activities was instead, if the regulations were different, and the regulations instead required that you build compactly and put those activities, extend the little railroad town so that at least those now become transit-oriented and have the ability to walk to the transit. You build a little more densely, put the retail at the ground floor, the other uses up above. And this is really this is then what the new urbanists are trying to do. Another one of the early diagrams that was that still is still very relevant was this one, which shows on the top the sort of typical suburban zoning regulations, which are really coming out of that Athens Charter SIAM idea that it's a good idea to separate out uses. So the shopping mall is on its piece of property attached to the arterial road. The apartment complexes are on another road, single road attached there. The single-family houses are on their own little cul-de-sac, dead-end road off that, and then the school. Now, a child living in the apartment complex cannot go visit a child living in the single-family homes without going out onto that arterial road. But because all the traffic is on that arterial road, no parent will allow their child to walk or bike that distance because it's incredibly unsafe. So you end up very socially segregated, very physically separated, and every single trip now has to be made by car. So Duane Plater Seiberg, one of the leading new urbanist firms, said, again, what if we took the exact same amount of uses, but reconfigured them in the lower half of the drawing with an integrated street grid, such that now, there's still uses are sort of grouped together, but at least you now have skinnier streets that are interconnected so that someone could easily walk or bike anywhere to any of the uses. You don't have to get out in your car except when you're actually leaving the entire neighborhood. But the argument was always both that once you allow for that kind of walkability, then you're facilitating more social interaction. If people are walking on narrow streets, cars aren't going to go too fast, they're comfortable streets, then you have a chance, you might see neighbors, they might be sitting outside, you have more chance of social interaction. And even if you're only walking for 10% of your trips, if most of the time you're still getting in a car, that's still 10% less air pollution, 10% less gasoline that you have to buy, all of those kinds of savings. So the environmental issues also have always also been quite important from the start. So as I said, the Congress for the New Urbanism we have a charter. You can go online, read the charter. The first line of the charter is this one here. The Congress for the New Urbanism views disinvestment in central cities, the spread of placeless sprawl, increasing separation of race and income, environmental deterioration, loss of agricultural lands and wilderness, and the erosion of society's built heritage as one interrelated community building challenge. Because up until this time, there was a tendency for different groups to want to work on different problems, but often be at cross purposes. So you'd have the environmentalists trying to stop growth out at the edge and put in growth boundaries, but that raises prices in the city. And the affordable housing folks are trying to keep the prices low in the city, but if they're not working together, you can't really try to solve any of the problems. So there's 26 other principles, and they go from the scale of the region to the city and neighborhood to the scale of the block street building. And the whole idea is very much to integrate the scales and recognize that you've got to solve the problems of the city and the problems of the suburb and the problems of the rural areas. You really have to be thinking about the whole thing. So a little bit of history. So new urbanism really kind of gets started in the 1980s. And at that point, it's totally, what the new urbanists are trying to rebuild towns that are mixed use, a little higher density than just everything spread out, and with a mix of incomes. And it's completely illegal. None of the zoning codes allow that. So the only place where the early new urbanist projects happen are in unincorporated rural areas in the middle of nowhere. Definitely didn't care that much about the aesthetic arguments. He is an environmentalist to his core. He cared about how the environmental problems of suburbia and sprawl, and how do we rewrite the regulations and reconfigure suburbia to integrate transit. So he came up with TODs, transit-oriented developments, and became one of the leading thinkers about how to extend transit lines out into the suburbs, but still with compact development around the nodes. So in the 1980s, you see TNDs and TODs, but generally out on the green fields. It's not until the 1990s that the new urbanists finally got a chance to actually work back in the cities. And it came through the invitation from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development asking Congress for New Urbanism, CNU, to write the design guidelines for the redevelopment of public housing. This happened under President Clinton. His Secretary of HUD, Henry Cisneros, was very concerned that in the worst public housing projects, poverty had become so concentrated that children didn't grow up ever seeing anyone go to work. And so then they never learned how to go to work. You were just repeating the cycles of poverty. And so he was arguing we need to redevelop our public housing projects with mixed income, so that, yes, there are the very poor, but they're also living nearby and are friends with kids who are market rate and whose parents are going to work, and get a mix of incomes. And the new urbanists were the only group who had a track record of actually trying to mix incomes. So the new urbanists were invited to write the design guidelines. And so what they argued for was that instead of the old model of the public housing, which is similar to the Soviet model, instead they said, let's put the streets back in, instead break up the super blocks by restoring the street grid, bring in something of a mix of uses. So in addition to the housing, get schools, shops, a little bit of job training. And then the housing should be built such that you cannot distinguish whose housing is subsidized and who is paying full market rate. You can't tell the difference at all from the outside, and the housing should basically look the same as whatever other housing is nearby around it. The argument was that a lot of the modern projects in the US were stigmatized because it was very clear, it was even called, you lived in the projects, not you lived in a neighborhood. So, and they tended to use they did deliberately rebuild with traditional building types, traditional lot sizes, plat sizes, and they used local labor as a way to train people in the area in the building trades, kind of to learn some of the old techniques. So it's quite a different proposal. So about 200 of these projects were built around the US, demolishing the worst of the most crime-ridden public housing projects and rebuilding them as mixed income, what are called Hope 6 projects. By the 2000s, then much of the work of the new urbanists, I mean, there's still some green fields going on, there's still plenty of inner city projects going on, but by the 2000s, there's more and more new urbanists are really working on retrofitting the suburbs. And these are a lot of the projects that I've documented. This I'm illustrating with one that's outside of Denver, Colorado, in a suburb there, where a big shopping mall that used to sit on a 100-acre superblock site has now had a street grid put through it such that it is now 22 walkable blocks with public streets, with retail at the ground floor and apartments or offices up above. It's the downtown that that suburb never had, but on the site of what used to be a shopping mall with, surrounded by parking. Now it's a walkable, mixed-use place, and with a couple of parks and a lot of bus service coming through. So in addition, and I like to distinguish, the projects of new urbanism are really done by individual new urbanists. There's about 3,000 official members of the Congress for the New Urbanism, but nobody controls the movement. It's what people, any developer can call their project new urbanist. We can't stop them. And people think of new urbanism as a variety of things, but the organization, CNU, the Congress for the New Urbanism, the organization doesn't do the projects. What the organization does is work on reforming the standards and changing the regulations that inhibit urbanism. So just as when the New Urbanists started, it was completely illegal to do a project like Belmar. Now, increasingly in more of the country, we've changed the zoning regulations, we're changing the street standards, we're changing the financing standards, it's becoming more and more possible to do this stuff. So I'll run through very quickly some of the tools that new urbanists use. Charrettes and community building at the neighborhood scale is always a big technique. The new urbanists, I think, in fact, it's one of the biggest distinctions from sort of old urbanism, is that the new urbanists always pay a lot of attention to involving stakeholders. A typical charrette will last about a week, and it's a very intensive week, but bring as many people as you can get from the neighborhood to come in. And it's a combination of, there's always a certain amount of education going on, helping them imagine what changes could happen in their neighborhood, and then learning from them what are some of the particular things in their neighborhood that they would like to see changed, and the particular things that they would like to see kept and remain. So a lot of listening to the neighbors. Certainly, typical new urbanist project tends to compose neighborhoods out of a mix of uses and different kinds of building types, but that tend to frame public spaces and streets. This is a project in Stockholm that we have an awards program. And you very clearly see, the buildings are framing this sequence of spaces from the street to the oval to the square, then down to the river. The new urbanists very much believe in producing master plans that are then governed by some sort of a regulatory mechanism, usually a form-based code. So as opposed to land use codes, which only dictate what they try to control uses and give you a certain total mass that you're allowed to develop, a form-based code actually gets it gets much looser on the uses and says what really matters are the shapes of the buildings. And you want if one side of a block, so in that lower right diagram, you can sort of imagine that the orange and the purple buildings are probably on the most major street, whereas the little red buildings, that's probably a minor street. So you're deciding where given the context, where the mass you need what kinds of building types. Whereas land use zoning at the top of that upper right diagram simply tells you, okay, you're allowed a certain amount, and you can either put it in one little needle or you can spread it out over the whole thing. There are different, form-based codes are intended to provide predictable diversity. So yes, there's a diverse group of building types, but it is predictable. So it's kind of an oxymoron, a little bit there, but not entirely. Another very important new urbanist tool is the rural to urban transect, which is used to try to establish diverse character zones. It's kind of recognizing that unlike sprawl, where we basically just have endless neighborhoods of single-family homes, and then you have a downtown, that we want to have areas that are completely rural, and we want to have areas that are completely urban, and we want to have some different areas, different characters in between. We're trying to provide a variety of choices for different kinds of households, but you behave differently. Just as the shoes you wear in the country are not necessarily the same shoes you wear in the city, the building types you put in one and the other are different. The street trees in the city go in a straight line. They are planted and pruned and shaped and very formal. In the suburb, the trees kind of are plopped around the lawn in a more informal manner. So, you get into character zones, and this becomes then the basis for those different form-based codes. So also a lot of attention to transit networks and then incorporating again those transect zones at the scale of an entire metropolis. This is some of Peter Calthorpe's work. And then finally, one of the newer tools, there's a group at CNU called NextGen. NextGen are the young new urbanists, and they have gotten really excited and done fabulous work at really promoting what's often called tactical urbanism. So tactical urbanism are efforts by mostly by young people. Especially during the recession that we've had in the US, there are a lot of underemployed planners and designers. And a lot of them have taken the time to even do things like yarn bombing. I mean, I don't know who takes the time to knit little sweaters for trees and traffic lights and parking meters. But studies show when yarn bombing goes in, crime goes down. It shows that people care about the public space. And we've been seeing just tons and tons of these different, whoops, I realize doesn't need to be there. Anyway, there's a lot of really interesting things. Much more. This sort of gets back to that almost more, who designs the city? I think the next gen are really working on sort of citizens. We do it ourselves. We just go in. It's do-it-yourself urbanism. It's not always sanctioned or legal, but you do it anyway. So the Congress for New Urbanism has an annual meeting. We'll have probably about 1,200 people in Buffalo in June, Buffalo, New York. But we also have initiatives where our members are really partnering with other organizations to work on reforming the obstacles. So we do a lot of work on converting highways to boulevards, on developing new standards for walkable urban thoroughfares, also a lot of really great and important changing the rules of the game. But there's also a lot of critiques of new urbanism. So the number one critique, you guys probably have all heard this, we get critiqued all the time for being nostalgic, Disney-fied, fake, phony places for the wealthy, trying to recreate public space, and public space doesn't exist anymore. Public space is dead. This is just utopian, imaginary, the Truman Show, little fake, phony stuff. The critique it started as soon as Seaside was getting built in the early 80s. And it's still there. I meet people all the time who really think, Seaside is now over 30 years old. And I meet people who really think, oh, new urbanism, you guys do pastel resorts for rich people. I'm like, well, that's one of the things. If you're looking for that, yes, you will find a few new urbanist projects that are pastel resorts. Seaside wasn't built for rich people. It was designed to be very, very affordable. The developer was 3 days away from bankruptcy when he sold his first building for $15,000, which is nothing. it became so popular because it provided a sense of community that he sold his last lot for $1.5 million. I mean, this was a huge, yes, there's a lot of money has been made at Seaside, but it's because it's rare, not because it was designed that way. But anyway, in terms of the nostalgia, what's kind of interesting is also that, so I'm showing Seaside over there on the left. This is the town of Prospect, Colorado. Both of these were master planned by Dwani Plater-Zyberg and designed with a code. DPZ did not design any of the buildings in either one. They did the master plan and the code. The people who bought the land, the clients, hired architects to design buildings they liked. In Florida, they went for pretty traditional. Now the code does require, Florida's in a hurricane zone. It was hit extremely hard by a hurricane about 10 years ago. It does require a pitched roof because they're in a hurricane zone. But they didn't require the style. The style came from the marketplace. Colorado is a much more funky, laid-back place. This is sort of outside of Denver, outside of Boulder, and there's a much more modern aesthetic, but it's a little mixed. There's a little bit of traditional and some sort of funky modern. So the market is pretty much deciding that. But yes, most new urbanist places are neo-traditional because that is what, in fact, most of the market in the US wants. What's also kind of interesting, I think, in the critiques is that from the right, the conservatives in the US, a lot of conservative developers, critique new urbanism as social engineering. You're trying to force people to be social. That's communist. Now, in the US, that's the critique that we get sort of from the right, that we're being over-controlling and trying to dictate people's lives. Meanwhile, on the left tends to critique new urbanists as being, you're too market-oriented. You're kowtowing to the developers much too much. Whereas the developers are the ones who are saying, yeah, you're trying to control me. So I'm always a little bit attracted. Anything that's sort of can be attacked from both sides has to have something good going on about it. But you do see then, as in particular in the public housing projects, I mean, you see a real range of work. The upper left, these are shots from a public housing project in Chicago that was Hope 6. And then here, a senior housing project in San Francisco with, again, much more contemporary kind of styling. But one gets different things. Another critique of new urbanism is that we're anti-high-rise and anti-technology. And Leon Creer is a member of the Congress for the New Urbanism and a very well-respected and well-loved member by many of the other folks within CNU. Not everybody, but by many. And Leon Creer, absolutely, he is anti-high-rise. And he is pretty much anti-technology. No question about it. So that's one of his cartoons on the left. But then but new urbanism is by no means anti-high-rise. Peter Calthorpe is doing, this is an illustration from one of his projects in China, and it's absolutely all about how do you integrate high-rises to create actually a great grand new avenue. And it's really all about just how the high-rises meet the street. If the high-rise still has to meet the street in an urban way, then hey, we're fine with high-rises. And then one of the other critiques that I think is actually absolutely right on, it's one that I've made many times, is that new urbanism loves the complexity of cities, and yet we have tended to design really oversimplified public spaces and open spaces and greens. And some of this goes back, I just figure I'll show Seaside because I've been talking about it. So Seaside at its center just has a big green. And then there's another one at the school. But there's a tendency to not really pay enough attention to the complexity of activities, the ecological functions that the open spaces and green spaces could be having, and that they're just undercooked. They're not as well thought through. I think the open spaces have actually always been one of CNU's kind of weaknesses. So it's kind of interesting then that it was, in particular, I think the notion of public space and the critique that CNU was way too limited in how it was designing public space that became opened the door then for everyday urbanism to come in as an alternative movement. So everyday urbanism, this is the cover of the book. Everyday urbanism argues that instead of city planning, we should be engaging city making by its inhabitants rather than planners or developers with master plans. And in particular, it also, everyday urbanism really was arguing that we need to expand our ideas of public space and our idea of multiple publics. There was a tendency to sort of always say, the new urbanists will often say, the public, as if the public speaks with a uniform opinion. And especially borrowing from feminist theory, everyday urbanists have argued, as soon as you do that, as soon as you say the public, what you're really doing is saying the public opinion of whoever has the most power, which will tend to then be the dominant white males in the American society. So this notion of multiple publics and really respecting that there are very different kinds of voices that might have different opinions in public space and that might be using different kinds of spaces. So in particular, everyday urbanism photographs things like this little driveway to a house in East Los Angeles where the owner of the house is using the back of their pickup truck as a place to sell produce. So turning their garage into a little shop and then selling things on the fence. And it becomes suddenly that little suburban place now becomes a place for more social exchange. And the everyday urbanists are sort of saying, this is great. This is actually, allowing people to get to know their neighbors better, to engage in perfectly healthy activity. And yet the argument was that, but the new urbanists would consider this way too messy. This wouldn't fit into the ideal image of the tidy little village that is what you tend to see depicted in the new urbanist images. Similarly, this kind of, image of of just everyday retail. It's not fancy shops. It's very ordinary, kind of lower class shops. The everyday urbanists sort of say, this is the public realm for most of the world, and it should be accepted and celebrated instead of the snobbiness of a lot of the new urbanists. So it's important to recognize that I think the everyday urbanists are coming they're coming out of California, out of Los Angeles, and they have a somewhat different context. So in the US, LA has long been considered, the poster child for sprawl. Now Atlanta, where I live, is really more the poster. LA has densified, but LA for years was always considered sprawling. So this is kind of their defense of LA against all that East Coast snobbery about sprawl. And it's a rejection of the East Coast hierarchies and the East Coast urban ideals. And this is what you typically find as movements kind of battle each other. The context is important. They tend to have that much more emphasis on lived experience instead of on sort of formalist design patterns, again, sort of a more LA thing. Very interested in empowerment of the unempowered. The everyday urbanists are only interested in existing communities and cities. They're just not interested in brand new suburbs at all. They embrace incremental change, not master plans. They see master plans as way too controlling. So it's a different kind of perspective. This diagram, I think it's a little hard to read, I'm sorry, but just compares developer-driven versus neighborhood-driven development. And you can imagine, they clearly like the neighborhood-driven, the idea that really it should be the neighborhood itself that designs the city. But what ends up happening is that it all sounds great, but there's almost no built example. There's very little influence. It's had very little actual influence. You see a few projects that are kind of like the tactical urbanists. Oh, let's put some kiosks on the sidewalk and try to help local businesses. But there's a dilemma for the professional who's trying to be an everyday urbanist. You can't, you're not, it's, all you can do is try to help the local folks, but it hasn't happened much. There's been very little actual everyday urbanism. And sort of raised a good point, it gets people excited, and then you end up with very timid projects and not much happens. Not timid has been Rem Koolhaas. Rem Koolhaas is anything but timid. And he actually, a little before the everyday urbanists, he came out with a much even harsher critique. But again, the context is pretty important. Rem Koolhaas, in 1994, he wrote 3 essays that he then published in SML-XL. In 1994, you would experience, the Berlin Wall had come down, the Soviet Union had collapsed, China had risen and embraced capitalism, and the European Union had been founded. Capitalism had essentially won. At that, it was deemed to be the end of ideology and the start of the New World Order. Appeals to the public good were increasingly swept away by the neoliberal globalization faith in markets to promote infinite growth. And so at an interesting time, most architects at that point were really talking about sort of esoteric post-structuralist theory or interested in cyberspace. The internet was really, really getting popular at that time. Koolhaas was one of the very few kind of architectural theorists to call attention to the implications for architecture of this massive restructuring of big business, big government, now the big EU, and the modernization of Europe, which his firm was very active in. He was suddenly getting commissions to do very big projects. So out of that, he writes the essays Light Urbanism, The Generic City, and Bigness. And so a couple of quotes, from him. He argues that planning has failed. The professionals of the city are like chess players who lose to computers. Pretty ouch. Kind of nasty. He argues that progress, identity, architecture, the city and the street are things of the past. The city is no longer, we can leave the theater. He's basically saying, the market has completely taken over. And we are all at the mercy of the market and the developers, the big corporations, the big money, the city, all our old ideas, totally yesterday. Bigness, he argues, is no longer, bigness meaning really big buildings, because we're building now at an ever bigger and bigger scale, bigger and bigger buildings. Bigness is no longer part of any urban issue. It exists. At most, it coexists. Its subtext is fuck context. That we just design big buildings that have no relation to the city. They take on and internalize the role of the city. And that shopping is our last public space. We don't have public space. We do not have a civic voice. I mean, you can read this as incredibly cynical, which he certainly has been critiqued for, or you can also say, well, he's kind of onto something that we don't quite want to admit. But he also critiques new urbanism in his Light Urbanism essay, in Whatever Happened to Urbanism essay, where he says, if there is to be a new urbanism, it will not be based on the twin fantasies of order and omnipotence. It will be the staging of uncertainty, that landscapes rather than buildings could serve as the framework really for urbanism. So if the new urbanists are really focusing on streets as the framework, and light urbanism is saying, no, it's really big buildings, the landscape urbanists are kind of coming in and saying, no, it's the landscape that can provide that framework. Now the context then for when landscape urbanism emerges is really that it's coming in the mid-2000s at a time when there's tremendous interest in environmental sustainability, climate, the need for resilience in the face of climate change. There's an awful lot of work to be done on reclaiming industrial waterfronts, industrial sites. So those are often kind of landscape projects. But there's also the context, whereas new urbanism arose when sprawl was kind of first being built, landscape urbanism arises when sprawl is out there. It's not going anywhere. It's not, you're not going to tear it down. It exists. It's a fait accompli. And the landscape urbanists basically said, this fantasy, their critique of the new urbanists was that the new urbanists are living in fantasy land if they think we're really going to convince everybody to go live in cities. The reality is more than half of the US population lives in the suburbs. Most of the population in most of the world lives actually, suburbs look very different in different places, but not in the highest dense places. So they were sort of, again, arguing that that low density shouldn't be so demonized in the way that the new urbanists really had. And there was also, I think, they came of age at a time where postmodern architecture was out of fashion, and high performance modern buildings were much more in fashion. And the ability to use imagery of natural flows of water kind of worked really well with all the digital blobby architecture of the sinuous lines of Zaha Hadid or other designers. So there was a sort of fashionability to the work of melding the landscape architect's work with some of the very high design architects' work. So the High Line is one of the the projects, often the built projects associated with landscape urbanism. The High Line was the before condition. This was an abandoned railroad, elevated railroad in New York City, right in Manhattan. And it had been abandoned for about 20 years, so grass and weeds were growing on it, and it was quite beautiful in its own way. But it was then redesigned as a public park with these sort of fingers of grass coming up, and a lot of attention to that sort of flowing geometries. And it's been remarkably popular. It's transformed. The buildings around it have all become highly valuable now. When they used to just be next to this abandoned railroad, now they're all very, very popular. And it's a good example of kind of high design catalyst for this reinvention of a post-industrial infrastructure. James Corner of Field Operations was the designer on that one. Another big landscape urbanist project, they're mostly parks and waterfronts. They're not really designing whole cities, although Charles Waldheim wants them to. So this is a landfill, so a garbage dump, basically, but that is being planned over a sort of 200-year process of how do we clean up use natural processes to clean the landfill and just gradually allow the landscape to emerge as a park. I mean, you'll shape it a little bit, but it's not so much designing a master plan. It's adapting to natural processes as you clean and filter this thing. One last sort of landscape urbanist project. This was a competition winner that is supposedly being built in Toronto, where this was former docklands. So again, it's sort of post-industrial, the docks at the edge of the city, now being converted to residential, but it's also where a river comes in. And so the central figure is really the landscape. The buildings are secondary, and there's almost no streets. And we see this in most landscape urbanist projects. If the new urbanists absolutely believe that the street grid is the fundamental DNA of urbanism, and I believe that, the landscape urbanists just sort of go, oh, streets are so 19th century. We don't want or need that many streets. If anything, if they have to do a street, they make sure it's asymmetrical. They never make the outdoor room. But a lot of people are sort of thinking that, well, is this battle between landscape urbanism and new urbanism really meaningful or not? So here's an image of Andres Duany, leading new urbanist, Charles Waldheim, the leading spokesman for landscape urbanism. And Waldheim has been very vocal in critiquing new urbanism, but Duany has kind of then been vocal back. And the two have had some very public debates, said really quite nasty things about each other. But at the same time, they're getting a lot of press and media attention. And it's sort of a little bit, feels like a manufactured debate. I mean, not entirely. Are these isms really that important? There are some very real differences between the two. So new urbanists on the left clearly look backward. They're doing empirically looking back. What are the building types? What are the development patterns that have worked well in the past? Versus the landscape urbanists who use a lot of digital parametric designs for sort of futuristic buildings, and based more on landforms than building types. And it's a very different, we don't know if this will work. It's a gamble. Maybe it'll be fabulous. I tend to think it looks really great for jewelry, but I'm not so sure it's great for buildings or cities. Clearly, there are these are sort of two different ways of being green. The new urbanists are green in the sense that they protect nature from sprawl, and they try to build in a mix of uses so that people don't have to drive so much, so there's less carbon. The landscape urbanists are much more interested they're green in terms of bringing nature into the cities, doing a lot of site regeneration of contaminated sites, but frankly, their projects tend to be very car oriented. They actually do have a lot of pretty wide streets and lots of garages and parking and driving. Two different ways of integrating ecosystem services into the urbanism. The new urbanists do a fair amount of quite interested now in urban agriculture and how to integrate agriculture both at the scale of really, out on the edge. So here's the transect, a full transect of how you have farming out in the truly rural areas, but you get all the way up to little window boxes in the most urban areas to grow things, and how to use the roofs, how to use the courtyards to really integrate agriculture at all throughout the transect. The landscape urbanists are looking very seriously at issues like how to grow more oyster beds on the shorelines of New York City to help actually stabilize the ground so that in storm surges, like with Hurricane Sandy and some of the other, as we're starting to see more sea level rise, that we need more stabilized ground. And so they're using aquaculture with the oysters, and now even calling it oyster texture and things. So you get real wild. You get very different attitudes, as I said, to streets. The new urbanists are always trying to build that street network and convert highways into boulevards, whereas the landscape urbanists almost celebrate the sort of formal language, the geometries of highway interchanges become now part of the architecture and the walking path system. There's sort of a love of those geometries. The new urbanists are, I think, often trying to address the middle class, the consumers, whereas the landscape urbanist, Charles Waldheim, is very upfront about the fact that landscape urbanism only happens if you have cultural elites who are patrons. It's, they're doing the projects. Their projects don't just happen. They have to be. There has to be an elite, and that elite then gets made fun of with things like the bullshit generator, which is pretty hysterical. But finally, I think that perhaps the most significant difference is this difference between the virtues of the planned versus the indeterminate city. We all want some freedom and we want some predictability. And how do we balance those two? The new urbanists, I think, see planning as essential to the equitable integration of affordability, environmental protection, transit, and public placemaking. Equity doesn't just happen naturally. You have to have planning if you want an equitable society. The new urbanists tend to position indeterminacy as a threat to middle class and property values, and they position the planner and designer as a community builder. The landscape urbanists tend to argue that reclaiming the natural order of self-organizing systems, is a natural, organic process that we should all respect, and who wouldn't? Self-organizing systems sounds pretty good. And they reject the bureaucratic world of form-based codes, U.S. Green Building Council checklists. They position the planned city as boring, pre-chewed, and a failure. And they position the starchitect as an icon maker, who's also himself, usually a him, not always, as an icon of individualism and artistic leadership. So, they're just very different proposals. And I don't know enough the situation in Moscow. Rem Koolhaas himself has sort of made fun of the way, and quite critically, the focus on the star architect and the icons. And he says, the work we do is no longer mutually reinforcing. He came up with this collage, his office came up with this collage, sort of the desert in Dubai with every building. If every single building is an icon, what kind of city does it make? And so he proposes, his newest building that he proposed was the anti-icon plain box. But this just sort of brings us back just to those questions. Who designs the city? The people, the elected officials, the developers, the planners, consultants? What are the conflicting issues? How does any of this relate to Moscow? And I think I've talked longer than I expected, so just open it up to you guys. What do you think?